Here we go. The water is wide, very wide. So that's one of the first things to understand when you had all those questions last night, and sometimes it felt contradictory impressions from it. There's a good reason for that. Because in fact, there is no one story that has it all. There is a first story in writing that is somewhat the jumping off point for later writings. But all of those got embellished along the ways too, because even before that first written story, there were other written stories that have been lost. And so there's no blueprint for what the Grail myth is. So much of it depends on a variety of writings, which appeared really in a 50-year period. They've been dated, the bulk of what was created and what became the foundational written versions of the Grail myth were created between 1175 and 1225. 1175 and 1225. Right? And within that 50-year period, all of the proliferation of stories in writing that we come to know as the Grail myth, which doesn't include Malory's, which came like 2 or 3 centuries later out of England, which is the one that most people think of around King Arthur thing and all of that stuff, right? Thomas Malory's version. That came even a few 100 years later. It's not one of the foundational texts for the Grail myth. And the first written version that we have came out of France. So that you've got a story about a Celtic British Norman king who might have lived in the 5th or 6th century, So a story coming from that world that makes its first appearance in France.
Where the Normans were.
Via Brittany. The Celtic world, in fact, traveled into France through Brittany. Through a series of invasions, they were forced out and had to disperse. And came in. And so that's one of the ways in which it made its appearance eventually in France. During a time of tremendous social, political, religious upheaval. I don't know if there's anybody in the room who can give us a flavor of what that turn of the turn of that first millennium was. Do you have any associations with that period, the year 1000 to 1100 or 1100, 1200? I mean, that's really the period what's generally called the Dark Ages, Middle Ages. What was going on at that time? Does anybody?
Wasn't Charlemagne like 900?
What?
800.
Charlemagne, so that's when Christianity got imposed in France.
800.
Right. And in fact, that's what took place throughout that European world, where in fact the church and the political institutions were the same thing. The church, the Roman church, had basically asserted itself as the major political structure and force. And so everybody was in relationship to that. And of course, when you have a high political institution like that, it will, with all that power, it will inevitably also be corrupt. So it was also a church that had become corrupted by its own power.
There's also crusades.
And the crusades were going on.
66, something.
Yeah.
It was 96, I think.
It was 1099 when they had captured the Holy City, when they captured Jerusalem, which they soon lost. But in the year 1099 is when they had gotten it. So I don't know the exact date when the Crusades began, but it would have had to have begun before then to finally succeed in. Right, and that was also the same year as the Norman invasion of England.
Now, is this also the time of the plague?
It's later.
That's
I think
later.
that's later, like 1300.
1300s.
There was a lot of famine, though, and devastation, so that when we see the wasteland in the myth, it really was echoing the conditions of the time. This was a time of feudal empires and barbarians roaming, and people, and the knights really were existing. I mean, that was their world, with swords and horses, and out there, that was true for them. That was what they were.
And they were
actually living.
basically the police force that was protecting the walled cities.
That's right. That's right.
Is it basically a Western myth? Does it?
Yes.
Do we find it in the East at all?
No, but what we will talk about is all of the Eastern influences on it.
On it.
Yes. And I think Simonetta's question last night was a fabulous question, and I think it has tremendous relevance for us as an international movement.
What was the question?
That is the Grail really is only a Western myth?
Okay.
And if so, how does it apply in a time when we're about diversity and as an international movement, how would that apply to people who are not from the Western tradition? So I think that's a real question. And I would say, yes, it is essentially a Western myth.
I probably.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that because the myth goes along with the Western view of the individual, which didn't come.
Thank you.
They
All
don't
right.
have that in the
All right, we're
East.
jumping way
Yeah,
ahead
okay,
there, but
all
you're right.
Okay.
And that's what will ultimately define it as
A
a
Western.
Western myth, because it gave birth to the concept of the individual and was the beginning of the Western turn toward individuality as the primary experience of being and the mode of life that would take primacy over the tribe and over the collective and over
Which
the
is
group.
also very Christian. The value of the human.
Right, but it hadn't emerged as strongly until that period.
But
Because in fact, when as the myth was emerging, within the church was the beginnings of lay people receiving communion. So that the individual within the church was coming up also. And at the time that the myth emerged, it was the beginning of Mary and Mary's presence as a figure within the church. Because women had like no place at all. I mean, once you came into, the hegemony of the institutional church, once you got past your early Christian communities, where women were very vital for the first 300 years, once the institutional church had taken control of all that, women had absolutely no place at all, and Mary didn't figure. And it wasn't until this period, this millennial period, through the influence of the knights returning from the Islamic world. And that's what, and in terms of this interfaith thing now, this is what I'm finding very interesting, because when I was studying this in like 1991, 1992, Islamic, I've seen them in the museum, and it's very beautiful. And, today, this relationship between our quintessential Western myth and the way it was influenced and created via the contact with the Islamic world is extraordinary and is full of, layers of meaning and possible significance. And so you had your crusaders leaving Europe, which was rather barbarian, truly, and at a very primitive state in these dark ages, riding off. Monty Python, she was talking about, so they go, they're riding off to the Crusades. And what they are finding is this exquisite culture.
Yes.
And many of these knights, coming into contact with the caliphs and with the knights on the other side, found themselves being more absorbed into what they were than intent on conquering them. Although there was certainly booty to be made. But there was a special group of knights, and I think they're I couldn't read the Da Vinci Code, but I've heard enough about it. I think they appear in the Knights Templar.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There was a special group of knights, and they were signified as the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar were begun by Bernard of Clairvaux, who was the reformist of the Cistercian monks. And so they were conceived as warrior monks.
Yeah.
Yes.
And these especially, see, they weren't there for the booty. They were there to rescue the Holy Lands. They had a spiritual mission in going there. And they were themselves monks who became warriors. So they had a very special way of being there that was different from the guys coming in to get gold. And it was their contact with this culture and a deepening understanding, and it is said, the learning of secrets related to their own Christianity.
Secrets.
Secrets, and that's part of the secret of the Grail. It's the secret. That they then, all of this, they brought back to Europe. And out of that came the beginnings of these heretical movements. The Cathars, the Albigensians, who seemed to settle around the Pyrenees, France, Spain, those areas. This was also the period in which the Inquisitions were beginning. Because, in fact, this was a moment when European Christianity could have taken another turn. And although I don't know all the details of these Albigensian and Cathar heresies, I think they're available if anybody wanted to explore them. But I think that what was essential about them, and what we find in the Grail myth, even in its Christianized form as a kind of heresy, is the idea that, first of all, the individual can make direct contact with God, does not have to go through the priests or the hierarchy. That's the meaning of the individual search for the Grail. That the individual is sufficient through spiritual deepening and self-realization to merge with the divine. All right? The other part of it is that the whole, the idea that you have a community in which women and everybody are equal participants in the sacred rituals and rites was also heretical at that time. And so they were holding masses, and once again, as in the early Christian communities, women were full participants in all of that. And that was also problematic for the Roman Church. And I think within that was some of the Gnostic thinkings, which have been revealed now through the Gnostic Gospels that have emerged. And those are a little bit trickier and more complex, and I don't want to go into them, but they do have something to do with that Jesus didn't really die, and Jesus was never really human, and all of these fine points around the divinity of Christ. And all of those have their own implications, so we won't go into that. But the point is they were definitely threatening for the church, and the church set out to destroy them, and in fact succeeded. So all of that's going on. At the same time that the idea of romantic love begins to emerge. Also influenced from the Islamic world. What the Knights found, the Knights Templar found, and even the other Knights who had less noble purposes, when they arrived there, there was this whole tradition, and had already expressed itself through many poets, of a certain adoration of the romantic female. Rumi and others spoke of their beloveds, and they were talking about God, but they were also addressing women. Romantic love did not exist in Europe.
How can that be? The Song of Songs is one of the most romantic pieces.
I know. But it hadn't translated over into the actual human woman.
Because I had heard that was used at wedding rituals.
Well, maybe it wasn't societal. Maybe it was an ideal, a religious ideal, and maybe not.
Right. I mean, the experience of women, the courtly love, okay? The rise of courtly love is what came brought back with the Knights Templar and the others.
But that would mean more respect for the women.
Exactly. And women sort of raised up.
Yeah.
And the cults of Mary began at that time.
But the pedestal.
What did you say, Emily?
The pedestal. And within the Christian roots, it's intrinsic to it is that Joseph of Arimathea brings the Holy Grail with Nicodemus and a retinue of people from their family and friends, and they go and they settle in Britain. And Joseph of Arimathea establishes the first Christian church in England, and it is dedicated to Mary.
That's the myth.
That's the myth. Well, it comes out of actually Christian apocrypha. The apocrypha are early Christian writings that were never incorporated into the canon. And so there were all of these writings, legends and stories that grew up around the Jesus stories and gospels.
Yeah.
That were never officially incorporated, but were having their impact on people. So that, when they sit around and tell stories, they're telling each other these stories. So this came out of the Christian Apocrypha, when it was written in the year 300, 400.
Who were these, who was it, Joseph of Arimathea, and who else?
Nicodemus.
Was in the Gospels.
Nicodemus?
Yeah, both of them are in the Gospel, and they figure at the time of Christ's death. So you've got these influences from the Celtic world. You've got these influences from the Middle East. Coming together in France at a particular moment, right? And giving birth to this whole series of legends and narratives and romantic poetry in which the Grail figures as the central symbol and the object that all of this is being directed toward. And with all of the variations, and I'll go into what they are, there are basically three streams of the Grail myth, and they have different meanings. Even though they're working with the same material, they have different implications, and we'll look at those. With all of that, in whatever form it takes, this Grail cup is somehow the object that will bring the one who can attain it into this form of completion and merging of the physical and the spiritual world. That they just come together in this place. Like the Grail is the axis mundi, that point where heaven and earth meet, where matter and spirit come together. And where all returns to its initial perfection. Okay, now let me give you some of these papers, and the visual aids might help. St. Francis was living at the same time with his stigmata, and his Reformation as the church. Yes, Francis was also around at this time. Now, when we say this time, we're talking the space of 100 to 200 years. But yeah, but these things are having their impact when you take the long view of history. These are eras.
Yeah.
And you get, and here, the other things of the women like Julian of Norwich and Hildegard von Bingen and the troubadours.
Well, here, the troubadours, the contours, the Welsh bards were the ones who brought the Celtic stories to the French courts.
Yeah.
So the bards were essential in the transmission of the Celtic myths. Because the courts, they didn't have TV, they didn't have Quiddler, they're sitting around, they want to be entertained. You need your bard. And the bard, in its origin, in its essence, is the one who carries the collective history of peoples. So they were bringing these lost stories, mixed legends, fantasy, enchantment, all of it sort of, and like I said last night, the remnants of lost rituals. They were the carriers of those, and that's what they brought into the French courts, mixing with the knights coming back with their stories of what it is like in the Middle East, and bringing back some secrets that they learned there. Giving rise to various heretical movements. Now, let's look at this one here, which is just saying what I said, the map, and it shows you the spheres of influence relating to this myth, and you've got that tiny little circle, Chrétien de Troyes, and the first real account of the legend, right? And you see, all right, it's coming over from the Celtic world via Brittany. Look at all of that coming out of the Middle East as the major influence on the myth. I wrote down below what's written there on the page, so you can see it, the Holy Lands, the Temple of Jerusalem, which the Temple of Jerusalem, there are some who say, is actually the model for the Grail Castle. The Crusades with New Islam and Oriental mysticism. And simultaneous with this, you've got stuff going on in Germany related to learnings of esoteric religions and forms and occultism, which I'll talk about later as one of the streams. And also, the Islamic world existed in northern Africa and Spain, and so that's coming up from the other end and bringing those influences.
But the Temple of Jerusalem didn't exist anymore.
No, but there was a way in which there were other things there that were replicas or thought to be replicas of that temple and the objects that had existed in it, which then got translated into the Grail Castle.
Yeah, okay.
All right, now look at this page, and this gives you a way of looking at the mainstream. It's an organizing principle that this guy, Magadli, in the book, The Holy Grail, the subtitle's rather cheesy. It's Origin, Secrets, and Mysteries Revealed. But it's actually quite a nice work and very geared toward the lay reader. This is how he's worked it out as a way of explaining the myth and a way to systematize the variations that exist. And based on other readings I've done, it feels true to me, and it's as good as any to try to make sense of it. So what he breaks it down into as the Celtic stream of the Grail stories, the Christian stream of the Grail stories, and what he calls the chemical stream of the Grail stories, which is actually made up of basically one major work, which came out of Germany. All right. So you got these three streams. Now, what might be the difference between them is the first question. What makes the difference? First of all, in the Celtic stream, I think there are a number of us who might have some sense of what Celtic sensibilities and perceptions of reality might have been rooted in. And even with the arrival of Christianity, it was always an uneasy relationship between the Celts and the Christians, and the incorporation of Christianity, and which was never fully Romanized, because that Celtic spirituality was so strong. And it is based in that the land is the goddess. The land, the material, and specifically the land is the goddess. And that this goddess is permeating everyday life, and that the other world is almost like just the flip side of here. It's not out there. It's right here.
The myths of Babylon.
Exactly. Thank you. And who was it? Lena last night who talked about the myths of Babylon, which is a wonderful representation of that Celtic perception of reality, and also a way of looking at the Grail myth, which did figure into it, and made an interesting twist on the appearance of the Holy Grail at the Galahad table, in which it seemed to be floating. But in the Myths of Babylon, it wasn't. It was being carried by Morgane Le Fay, who was one of the keepers of the sacred waters and the sacred cup on this other world, just like a veil. You go through the fog and you're in there. Avalon, by the way, was supposed to be located right next to Glastonbury, and Glastonbury is where this first church, begun by Joseph of Arimathea to honor Mary, existed. So all of these things are like overlaid on each other. In fact, the way Europe, always overlaid its churches on ancient goddess pagan sites. So you have a Celtic perception of reality that keeps the spirit world always in the physical world, and at any moment, under the right conditions, you're going to cross over into a world of enchantment, into a world that is not always subject to the physical laws of this world. So that sometimes when people pass over into that other world, they don't age. So they could be over there for 80 years, and it's like it was a day. And stuff happens. And the stuff that happens isn't always logical or rational. But it makes sense in its own terms.
Just tell me what things mean.
All right. In that Celtic universe,
Okay, where's another
for a king to have the right to rule, he needed to be in relationship with the goddess. His right to rule was utterly dependent on his being in a relationship with the goddess as represented by one of her priestesses. And the ritual part, as we're able to decipher it, of course, you know, people go back archaeologically and they try their best to sort through what these things might have been about. But it was shown, you know, the way it was imagined and worked out in the myths of Avalon makes sense in terms of what someone like Jesse Weston says about this ritual vegetation theory of the Grail myth. Every year, the king and his representative would come together and have sex. Now, there were a whole lot of rituals and rites around this ceremonial intercourse between the king and the priest and the goddess. This union of the two. And in that partnership, he was allowed to rule for another year. And also that partnership ensured the fertility and the regeneration of the land for another year. So that the relationship of the goddess and the king only wasn't in the interest of the king, but the fertility of the land was absolutely depending upon this relationship and it being enacted in a yearly cycle. Because the other thing about the Celtic world is it doesn't have a linear view of history. It has a cyclical view, in which history is almost irrelevant. It's like life just goes through its cycles in the same way that you have winter, spring, autumn, fall, winter, spring, fall. Everything just repeats itself. And in that sense, the individual is almost lost. The individual is just one more example of a human who lives winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall. And what happens to me doesn't just happen to me, but it happens to other people too. And that's all there is. Fairies, tricksters, things appearing and disappearing. We've got the leprechauns, you know, as a remnant of all of that kind of thinking. That was common for that perception of reality, that these things happen in this world of enchantment. And you were either experiencing it in dreams, or you were somehow aware of it being around you, even if you weren't present to it. But the possibility was always there. So when these stories came into France, into Europe, people found them really fun. They were very enchanting. And they were associated with all sorts of adventures of knights and ladies and women and hags and crones and, you know, this whole variety of characters that would give that,
Wizards.
and wizards, Merlin, who was some mix of devil and high spirit shamanic being, who somehow gets Christianized at a certain point. And you can imagine that different bards are coming by and telling different stories and making stuff up as they go along with all of this material. But what they were carrying with them was still this memory of this object that was the source of such plenty and abundance. And it had various forms. So, you know, today we know of the cornucopia and the horn of plenty. There were cauldrons. In fact, when Chrétien de Troyes, the first one who wrote it down, when he depicted the Grail cup, it wasn't like this. It was a really big dish, and it was full of food. This is the Celtic. This is the Celtic world. Really good food. And in fact, in some versions, what was in there was whatever food your heart most desired. But it was just food. And surrounding that was just this sense of pleasure and well-being and magical, benevolence. And all is well.
Aha.
All is well.
All is well.
All is well.
Sounds like paradise.
Exactly. So it's a return to paradise. And in fact, many of the many cosmological systems vision paradise as just this lush garden where you have whatever fruit, whatever you want to eat. So eating is basic, in that world and in that time. Imagine, you're living in a continent that's being barren and being put to waste by wars and famines and sickness. The idea of all this abundance at your will wasn't just, oh wow, wouldn't it be good to taste some steak today? It was like, wouldn't it be good to just feel I don't have to worry about eating anymore. So this was so much fun, and people and people were so enchanted by them that even the queens in some of these courts were high commissioning writers to write stories, and in some cases telling them what they should write, because they liked it so much. Now, it took hold of the populace in such a way that the church felt that they needed somehow to integrate it into Christianity. And I dare say, wanted to integrate it because it was so charming and it was so interesting for people. So what did this have to do with us? Because it was essentially a Christian culture.
What year did the church do that?
At around the same period. They were all doing it at the same time. But we do know Chrétien wrote the first, and that we still have. He does not reference Jesus in it. He does not reference the cup as even holy. It just has these magical powers and the ability to instill well-being. It wasn't long after that, though, that Christian writers begin to take it on. And the first record of a Christian writer taking it on was a monk who, what was his preface? He had a preface that I like a lot. All right, so here's what he says. This is the book of thy descent. Here begins the book of the Holy Grail. Here begins the terrors. Here begin the marvels.
The marbles?
The marvels. So that's the first Christian reference.
And who wrote that?
If I can pronounce this, Helenandus. Helenandus.
When did Chrétien de Troyes write this?
Louder.
Around 11, well, somewhere, let's say 1170, 1190. Now, before we leave the Celtic myth, just one other thing I want to say, because not only did Chrétien write that, but there was also appeared the preface to Chrétien, which I believe he also wrote, and if not, somebody who was taking off from that clearly, called the Elucidations. And the Elucidations tell you what was happening before all the Knights and Percival and all that occurred. Now, the story of the Elucidations is this. Once there was a kingdom called Logres, L-O-G-R-E-S, and in that kingdom, like the Mists of Avalon, women kept the sacred waters, as we spoke of last night, and the sacred vessels for drinking from the sacred waters. And pilgrims would come, and travelers would come, and they would take of this, and as healing was needed, it was offered and given and received. And this went on for a very long time. And these women were also in relationship with the knights who would come and the priestess, the chief maiden, the chief of all of this, like Morgan Le Fay in the Miss of Avalon, would go through the yearly rituals of the king, and the world stayed fertile. The king ruled with the authority of what was called sovereignty, the representative of the goddess. The world was right, it was in balance, it was paradise. Okay. One day, this one king got tired of this arrangement. He said, why do I have to go to them to get the cup? It's so easy for me. I'm just going to take that cup. Not to mention, I'm going to rape her while I get it. Why ritualize these things? I just want her, I take her, I want the cup, I take the cup. And in fact, that's what he did. And his knights were so impressed with this act that they decided to go there and do the same to all the other women who were there. So there was this general raping of the women, the taking of the cups, and the result is that the water stopped flowing. Nothing would grow, and that's the beginning of the wasteland. That's the elucidation of the Grail myth. In the Celtic stream, that's the elucidation and the origin of the Grail. And then, the next time we see the cup, it's kept in this castle that's surrounded by a wasteland and a wounded king. So that makes a little bit of, a sense of these things. And these knights, who are now charging out to get the Grail, not just for themselves, but to heal the relationship and the split in order to have the land be fertile again. And that's why the Grail myth is so rich with understanding patriarchy, its effect, and the environmental result of all of that. But not that patriarchy is bad, and not that matriarchy would be good, but that what is required is this balance and union and mutuality between the two in order for the land to survive. Okay. Moving on. Soon after all of this is out there, the church enters. And it was mainly the Cistercians, which is the order, in fact, of Bernard of Clairvaux, who took on the Latin Vulgate and this Vulgate cycle, telling all of these Grail stories. Okay. Now, obviously, in their story, we've got the original paradise, not of Logrish, but where Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, the fall, right? Jesus comes to redeem that fall, bring salvation, but people, of course, continue almost like in the Celtic way. Forget the linear, right? They just keep repeating the same sins over and over again. But at least now there's the possibility for salvation as represented by Jesus. So that when the myth enters in the Christian stream, what you will get are heroes who are in fact Christ figures, and who will take on the moral trappings and beings appropriate to a Christ figure and a monastic model of what it was to be a virtuous knight, what it was to be a good person. And so whereas in the Celtic stories you've got a lot of robust living and food and these knights could attain the Grail and they would still mingle with the virgins in the castle, and they didn't have to be chaste, they didn't have to be pure, they had to have character and to be good and to want to find it, basically. In the Christian version, you now must be chaste, but you are also called to the other two values of the Cistercian monks, which has to do with charity and mercy. And so in this model, whereas the first model, the Celtic strain, is about regeneration and renewal in a cyclical way, in the Christian versions, what you've got is redemption and salvation as the main thematic motifs that keep appearing. So you're in a line going from paradise to the apocalypse. And the Grail hero is somehow existing in this continuum of the human species movement from paradise to the last judgment, to the ultimate end. That's a big difference. And both of those, and we can find both, we can certainly find that historical sense within ourselves as Western people. And that's also makes it very Western, this idea that we're moving in this direction toward an ultimate end. What's it called biblically? There's a word for it, the end time.
Epistemology.
Eschatology.
Eschatology.
Yeah, eschatology. We're living in eschatological times. And then coming out of Germany, you've got this guy, Wolfram von Eschenbach. All right? And he's taken on what he's taken on in his version of what the project is to bring these two together. So how do you bring together the lone hero going off to find the Holy Grail, bring that together with a view of history that is really about cyclical and relationship with nature and the land? And of course, in the Christian versions, it's not about relationship with nature, it's about relationship with the supernatural. In the Celtic version, it's the human relationship with nature, which is thought to be imbued with the divine. Yeah, in the Christian version, it's not nature. You have to overcome nature to arrive at the supernatural, which then you establish relationship with that.
When does the cup, as the Last Supper cup, come in?
Okay, so all right. So you got Jesus. Thank you, Carol, because this brings us back to the origins of the thing. So, all right. So the fall, Adam and Eve, Jesus comes, and now we get the appearance of the Grail cup. Kay, your question: was it at the Last Supper? Was it held to catch the blood? Both of those things. Mm-hmm. Depending upon who's telling the story. Because in the same way that you had all these these Celtic bards going around telling and enhancing, you had Christians who were doing the same. You had Christian writers. The Cistercians oversaw the project, but they hired it out to writers to do it for them of various kinds. And so different ones of them were coming back with different understandings, and plus there were all these other, renegade folks who had taken on this idea of the cup as related to Christ and taking it from there. And in some cases they put the two together, in some cases they kept them separate. But whichever that was, the point is Joseph of Arimathea had it. That they all agree on. And he had it because Christ wanted him to have it. And in fact, Joseph was put in prison because of the ways in which he was attached to Christ, who at that point was a criminal, and the Romans were after Jesus, and they were after Jesus' friends, and Joseph ends up in prison with the Grail cup. Don't ask me how. But he's got it, and the blood. And Jesus appears and said, this is what I want you to do. Go with Nicodemus, go with his family, get on a boat. You're going to find this island far away, and you're going to stay there, and you're going to build this church, and you're going to dedicate it to my mother. The walls of the prison lift up. So here comes that Celtic magical enchantment thing enters also into the Christians' ways of perceiving and understanding the story.
I hear that.
They come together.
Uh-huh.
So the walls are up, and off they go in their boat, and they in fact get to Britain.
And
And
this
they
is
do.
before the Germans got a hold of
Oh,
the
yeah.
story. Okay.
Oh yeah. This is like part of the Apocrypha.
Okay.
Right. And so what the writers then, at the same period, they just incorporated that Apocrypha into their understanding of where the Holy Grail came from, and thereby Christianized it. Interestingly enough, also bringing it out of the Celtic world. And so it was Joseph and his family who were the original guardians of the Grail, and through Joseph's bloodline, the guardianship of the Grail passed on to his descendants. Blood is very important in the Grail, and bloodlines are sacred also. And you always find out that the Grail hero has a blood relationship with the wounded king.
Oh.
Always. Yeah. Now, part of the heresy of the Grail myth, because I was always asking, what Christians, right? Even though it was Christianized, what was the implication of that? Because it didn't seem that it was orthodox, right? Certainly the fact that it came back with the Knights Templars, who had had their own conversion in the Middle East and certain Gnostic ways of understanding God, and the rise of these heresies, certainly helped to support a myth that was willing to accept as sacred and worth your life's journey to find a cup that did not come through the apostles, but rather a sacred relic released by Christ to a non-apostle, Joseph of Arimathea. So that in itself was extremely threatening, or you would think would be extremely threatening to an Orthodox church, which insisted that its authority came through the descent of the apostles. Also about bloodlines, except not exactly blood, but almost as if. These lines of descent are always important in the myth. So that there was a way in which you would have thought the church would have tried to stamp it out. It was saying you don't need the priest to get to God. You can go out on your own individual journey and meet the divine. And by the way, the cup you're looking for is sacred and has to do with the ultimate presence of Jesus on this earth. And it came from somebody who wasn't even an apostle. There's no way of knowing why they didn't decide to stamp it out. The hypothesis is that it was so coded and entangled, and in its Cistercian and then later Dominican versions, so imbued with the presence of Jesus and Christ and the Eucharist, and taking that cup now, and it's not just about coming forth in a feast of abundance and all you could eat, but it's the Mass. The food now is the Eucharist, and the wine is the blood. Right? That it became so Christianized and so something that the church could so relate to that the heresy didn't seem important at that point, because it was serving its purpose, which was to encourage this fervor of the people at a time when they were wanting the lay people to take communion, to be more connected with the church. So that's how that all evolved, and that's the meaning of the cup itself and the Grail in that version. And then you've got this one that came out of Germany, but around the same time, but was trying to reconcile these two streams. And in a way, for us today, it could be the most interesting, although I think they all have their own virtues. All right, so here's the original Paradise in the German version, in Eschenbach's version. All right. You remember that's also an apocryphal story. Remember the fight of the angels in heaven when Adam was created? And God told the angels, you will bow down and worship my new creation, man. And Lucifer says, no way.
We were here first.
We were here, but not only to you will I bow down and worship. So the thing to know that rarely in the Grail is everything simple. It's always complex, and that's what makes it so rich, and why people give their lives to studying it. Lucifer says, no way, only to you, dear Lord, will I ever bow down and worship. So, God was pissed, that wasn't what he wanted, and the angels had a fight. And 1/3 of the angels stayed on God's side.
I know, the percentages are never clear.
And 1/3 of the angels were on Lucifer's side. Lucifer, by the way, which means light, and its root meaning is light. And 1/3 of the angels were neutral.
Neutral.
Here we are. Then we start searching.
And in the fight which ensued, Lucifer is cast, with his angels, is cast out of heaven. And it somehow loosens a stone or a jewel from his crown, which the neutral angels catch and carry down to earth. It's a stone, this Grail.
Evil.
Lights.
Questioning.
I'm sorry, is this the German?
Yeah.
You're talking about, yeah.
This is, let's think of it not as the German, but as the alchemical version, okay? It is strongly related to alchemy as the journey of attaining the Grail. The stone, which resonates right immediately with the whole idea of the philosopher's stone, which is essential for the turning of earth, air, fire, and water into their higher forms. And in the course of the desire to turn earth, air, fire, water into higher forms, what is actually required is the purification of the practitioner to understand how to do that. That's built into the whole alchemical understanding, which there really were alchemists at that time. In the same way there were astrologers. There wasn't astronomy, but there were astrologers. And there was alchemy. And by the way, at the same time that this was being written, the tarot deck made its appearance in Europe also. Which just happened to have as its major suits the cup, the sword, which is essential in the Grail, but that I haven't talked about. Very often people get nervous when you start talking about the sword. The dish, the paten, and the spear.
And what?
The spear, which are the 4 suits of the tarot. In appearance, it's got a procession going on, and in the procession you will always have a cup, a dish, sometimes if it's a Celtic version with a head on it, talking. A sword dripping blood into the cup, and a spear or a lance.
A club.
Right. So those are called the 4 hallows, H-A-L-L, the 4 holy objects of the Grail.
And playing cards came from that too.
Right. Right. Oh my gosh. So you've got astrology going on. You've got the tarot making its appearance with using these 4 hallows. You've got what was the one we were talking about? Alchemy. Yes. Numerology also figures strongly in this version. So there's all this. The way he sets up his chapters are related to the astrological configurations, and numerology figures strongly, and it's all coded in that way. It's a fascinating thing. I myself could not be able to figure it out, but it's much better to read about it in the commentary related. These things are very dense. Very few people actually read the dense. They're too dense. They're too hard. It's much easier to read commentary about it, although then what you lose is the original source. And you see how motivated you are to go there and clear away all the mustiness and the
The language is so different.
And the language is so different.
Yeah, so hard.
Okay, so all of that, 1/3 God, 1/3 Lucifer, 1/3 neutral, bring the Grail down, which was the stone from Lucifer's crown, which in the coming down from heaven, in some versions, tellings of it, went from stone, which is typical of the paten, the idea of the dish, to sword, to spear, until it finally made its way into the form of the cup. There are some who say that that's the way it worked, or some that say it just came directly down as an emerald or as a stone vessel of some kind. So that's the prologue, that's the paradise. Here comes the hero, Percival. Percival goes the in between. Pierce the valley. Go the middle way. The whole sensibility of this version of the Grail is that there's darkness and there's light, and nothing will ever be perfect. And everything will be a mixture of these two things. And the best that the human and the hero can do is to somehow walk the middle way, always seeking more light. That's about as much as you can do. And so the early images of the poem relate to images of the magpie, which is black and white, and various echoings of this idea. You've got darkness, you've got light, you've got black, you've got white, and somewhere we're all existing in a middle way. It's the emergence of the first really existential hero, in a sense.
That's what came.
Right? That is somebody who's just sort of making it up every day as they go along. And when you're making it up every day as you're going along, sometimes you're on this linear progression, redemption, salvation, and going, onto the plan where ultimately you're part of the last judgment. And sometimes all you got is winter, spring, summer, fall. Who am I? What am I? Winter, spring, summer, fall, and just the cycles. And somehow bringing these two things, and where is God? Right? Now it's not just God in the Eucharist and God in the Grail, but it's like, where is God around me? How do I make sense of the everyday life and every moment that I'm living? These are things that we so take for granted that we don't realize how remarkable it is to come to that out of a collective tribal mentality, which the church itself was encouraging a collective tribal mentality. We're all going to think the same. We're all going to be the same. The emergence of individuality was an extraordinary moment. And this third version of an individual hero who, through the influences of various occult, and by the way, this dark light thing is very Tao, T-A-O, the Tao, the yin and the yang, and so that there are clearly influences into this coming not only from the Near East, but from the Far East. And that ultimately when the Grail hero finds his way back to the castle, once he's spent like 50 years figuring out he had to ask the right question, once he got that part, now he's ready to go back to the castle. He's been through all of the purification it takes to get there. The only way he's going to get there, Parsifal, he has to let go of the reins of his horse. He has to let the horse take him there. Stream of the myth around the dark and the light. In this version, Parsifal has a black brother, half-brother. His father, the Crusader, in the Middle East, met a woman from Africa and they married. She was a queen. They married. He gave birth to a child. She gave birth to a child named Fierfiege.
Named who?
Fierfiege. F-I-E-R-F-I-Z. Fierfiege. And the father wasn't much of a great guy, so right. So it was time to go back to Europe. He left her. He left the child. Goes back to Europe. Marries another woman who gives birth to Parsifal. And then of course he leaves her too, and he's gone. The fathers don't stay around. The real heroes. So and they're both knights in different sides, And at a certain point they meet in a battle. And Parsifal's sword breaks, and Fierfiege decides he doesn't want to kill him. So they sit down and they talk. And in the trading of stories, they figure out, oh my God, wait, I have the same father you do. Whereupon they start to journey together. And when Parsifal, in this one, attains the Grail, it is with Fierfiege, however you say it. They do it together. And in fact, Parsifal has already met a woman in another castle who he is married, and Fierfiege sees the Grail maiden at the appearance of the Grail. He doesn't see the Grail, he sees the maiden. And he falls in love with her. And because he falls in love with her, he agrees to be baptized. At which point he's then able to see the Grail also. And on the stone, there is a message. This is the one, the only telling of the story where there is a written message on the Grail. And this is the message on the Grail. If any Knight Templar of this community should find himself, by the grace of God, the ruler of a foreign people, he must ensure that they are given their rights.
Wow.
Ooh, this was an important thing, huh? That I should have told you this morning.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm glad it came out. Thank you.
Wow. Except they can't be Muslim, they just have to have their rights. Their religious freedom.
But they must be, yeah, but nothing.
After they've been baptized.
All right, contradictions. Anyway. But that's how that whole walking a little way, the darkness and the light thing finally played itself out with the black and the white brother.
So it had a happy ending.
Yes, very much so.
I like a happy ending.
And Theophige and the Grail Maiden ended up giving birth to a child and taking the child and going to India. And the child that they gave birth to was Prester John, who has a whole other history that puts him in Africa. So if we're asking questions about the relationship of various cultures and things, it's there. Okay.
That's what Ethiopia is called, Prester John, the land of Prester John. Interesting. Oh, that's,
I don't know the name Pastor.
Yeah, he's got a whole myth around him.
King Arthur's relative?
Yes, and he was this like saint Messiah figure, and vanished. But there's always a legend that he's going to return. Anyway, so that's that.